Well, this may be all who will join us, at least at this stage. And actually, that's the word that I want to kind of push off from, stage. I think it's appropriate for me to introduce myself. I'm John Mowat. I'm working with Sam Belinfante on this Sadler Seminar project, The Tunings of the World. And we have been working hard to bring together some of our favorite people in thinking about these kinds of questions, these kinds of aesthetic practices. And we're very fortunate to have third part of the third measure here in the project space from the Otolith group to really kind of serve as a continual touchstone for what we're interested in pursuing. I said stage, and what I meant by that is that I just would like to try to set a few things in motion by drawing attention to aspects, I guess I would say, of our situation, of our context. So I'm thinking initially about the fact that about a century ago, Carter Woodson in the United States fought hard for and actually did receive federal acknowledgement for something he was calling Negro History Week. And this was an effort on Woodson's part to bring to the national stage the question of to what extent does that country, founded so deeply on slave labor, literally, to what extent it could bear to remember and acknowledge this experience. And it was controversial, as you might imagine, but ultimately it actually did grow. And in the 1970s, I think it was coordinated with the bicentennial, the founding of the US. Then President Ford decided it was time to have what was still being called Negro History Week. That too was immediately transformed via pressure from the obvious and predictable sources into something called Black History Month. That month is this month, February. The reason that it is February is because on the accounts of those involved in forming this event, it mattered in this memory that we remembered President Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but also Frederick Douglass, who was born a few days after Lincoln was born in the month of February. This tradition has also come to the UK, although much later. But here we are thinking about Julius Eastman, thinking about third part of the third measure in the context of this month. Now, much of what goes on around the marking of the passage of this month, at least in the United States, is pretty tawdry. So I just want to emphasize my own sense that this is the right way to think about the importance of something like Black History Month. And so I just want to mark this as an occasion, somewhat fortuitously falling in this particular time period, but in a certain way also destined for this time period. Another aspect of the staging involves thinking about how we're going to proceed and how I'm thinking about the way we proceed. And I want to invoke the memory here of a dead white queer, very important critical musicologist, Christopher Small, whose book on music of a common tongue is still one of the defining musicological engagements, the music of the African diaspora. And what I want to pluck from Small's discussion is his concept of musicking. And I'm interested in it, not so much because, as was said about it at the time, it invited us to think about music as an activity, as a process, perhaps even as an event, rather than as a thing. I think that more importantly was specifically the way Small was trying to get at what made music a process or an event. And what he was stressing here very much came out of his thinking about certain practices characteristic of those musical traditions that came from Africa to the so-called New World in the context of the slave trade. And specifically, Small was interested in the rhythmic structure of what we call pretty routinely now call and response forms. This is very characteristic of the field songs that at a certain point were being recorded by the Lomaxes, but they're also very much important, I think, in terms of thinking about many of the popular forms that we now recognize as part of Black musics, from the blues to pop and jazz. And Small was keen on this concept because what it asked him to do was to consider in what way the reception of performance becomes part of the performance, becomes caught up in the performance. He also drew attention to the varying ways in which reception becomes caught up in performance. Everything from call and response structures where people are responding to calls from a stage, but clapping as well, the idea of clapping along, but then clapping in response to a piece of music. These all became ways for him thinking about the extended percussive field of a popular piece of music. Now I'm bringing this all out here because I am trying to think a little bit about how to proceed here. And I'm thinking about inviting all of us at some level to think about how we are engaged in a kind of musicking with this particular piece of the otoliths group, which is itself obviously a performance. It's a performance of a performance, a recording of a performance of a performance. But how do we work with it? How do we take it up? How do we, as it were, music with it? I think that's something we want to be thinking about all the way through, because my feeling is that one of the things that we achieved with some clarity in the first session was this idea that we need to be resistant to this idea of kind of separating off different aspects of what's going on as something to be treated in light of that separation with kind of a special form of attention. Our attention needs to recognize itself as implicated fully in what it is that we're trying to attend to. So I'm looking for kind of conversation, if you will, that's going to take up this kind of logic of the call and response, and not simply thinking now of call and response as two different things, but as part of one event, the rhythm of an event. This brings us to a little bit of thought, I should think, now about the fact that we're trying to do this in, broadly speaking, a university setting, a university situated in the north of England, a university very traditionally a white university, a university that sort of emerged out of laboring classes in this particular part of the country in relation to its history. This is where this has happened. This is its situation. And I think we're trying here to think a little bit about how we take that up when we engage with the materials before us. and with what we've brought to share with each other. So we're very lucky. I love these kinds of trivial linguistic observations, so bear with me. This session is going to sing. We have two speakers, both of whom have the word sing and name sing in their names. Danveer Brar Singh, or Singh Brar, is a colleague here at the University of Leeds, and he teaches in history, Black British history in particular. He's a published author. He has some remarks he'd like to share with us in relation to Eastman and this particular iteration of his oeuvre. The other Singh we have is Nicolas Singh, a former colleague, who's now in fine art and curation at Manchester Metropolitan University. She is herself a performing artist and a writer, scholar, artist, musician. She has many tricks in her bag. So I think what I will do at this point is simply invite us to sort of get underway with some efforts to sort of take up the place and the thing that we're working with and try to treat it with some sensitivity to the sorts of issues I've tried to frame around it. I know that Nicola has some prepared remarks, and it may be best if we invite you to begin, Nicola, simply because I want to be sure you have time to do what you want to do. I don't think the structure will involve your intervention and then our reaction to it. I think what we'll do is we'll just hear what you've brought us to share. We will turn then to Danveer, and we'll see where this thing takes us, at which point I'm kind of imagining a free-for-all. So please, Nicola, if you wouldn't mind getting us rolling.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so maybe this will take about 15 minutes, I think. And I'm reading from notes, but no slides or anything, so don't feel like you need to look at the screen. Do whatever helps you to listen best. So I'm going to track through my experiences with Eastman's work, talking about how they've influenced my practice and my pedagogy, and also include some connections and threads to other artists' work that resonate. In this context, I'm also going to be speaking to the ways in which Eastman's fullness and these interconnected threads have the potential to light the often dark spaces of academia in particular, in relation to epistemologies and to racial consciousness and racial justice. So I'm talking about Eastman's legacy, I guess, and from a very personal and situated perspective as a queer woman of colour who was born and brought up in the northeast of England, and from a local-ish perspective as I used to teach at the University of Leeds, who are hosting this project. And I also get a bit jittery talking about Eastman's music, as I struggle to put it into words, and I don't necessarily want to analyse its shapes and its forms. The first time I heard Eastman's music was in watching the Artlift Group's third part of the third measure, which is central to this Staging Eastman project. The film was screened in an event curated by the artist Harriet Lewis and presented at Tyneside Cinema in Newcastle in 2019. I was lying down on the floor on my belly. Harriet had rejigged the cinema into a more informal viewing and moving space to resonate with their research into expanded feminist pedagogies. And I remember feeling my body harden as I listened and watched Ottilist's film, exhilarated and charged. And then I felt kind of outraged after reading into Eastman's music more after that event. I studied experimental music performance at undergraduate level at Dartington College of Arts in Devon, which is known for its reputation as a school of progressive and expanded practices. I was there from 2008 to 2019, and whilst I was taught about many of Eastman's contemporaries, I was never introduced to his music. As this event foregrounds, Eastman's music was largely neglected until the early 2000s and is only now gaining traction in music and fine art education, thanks to the amazing work of the other speakers in today's program. I listened to Devon Haynes play an adaptation of Eastman's music as I wrote part of this text. Solo piano, the notes rumble and fly, and I think I noticed my breath rounding out my belly as I listened. Attention, the groove, presentness or presencing are all terms I would associate with the experience of listening to Eastman's compositions. And French philosopher Simone Weil says that attention is the highest form of prayer. I departed from this notion of attention or presence in a seminar for MA students at Leeds Uni when I taught there as a part-time teaching fellow on a fixed-term contract. I sung the opening few lines of my lecture, which began with personal reflections on how I understood the atmosphere of the university was affecting my nervous system, my synapses snapping. I made reference to Sarah E. James's text, Sickness and Solidarity, written around the time of the 2020 UCU trade union strikes against inequality, workload, casualisation, and levels of pay for staff in higher education. James's text partly calls for experiences of failure and fragility to be shared between those working in higher education as a means to counter the oppressive environment. 2 years on, and this talk has been rearranged around another set of UCU strikes against the same untenable and precarious working conditions, which includes a race pay gap in the sector. In 2021, this was said to be a 17% difference between staff who are white and those that are Black and people of colour. In that same seminar, I shared insight into the film Praying Mantis by Jake McGinstey, which documents the life of African-American percussionist legend Milton Graves. Graves talks about ways of vocalizing, of paying attention to the taste of a sound and the anatomical structure involved in the expression of that sound as it leaves our physical body. Translating taste, as in taste, on tongue, in mouth, through body, onto the different notes. In listening to Eastman's prelude to the Holy Presence of Joan d'Arc over and over again on a research residency I did at Hospital Fields in 2019, I felt a pretty desperate desire to put the song in my mouth and on my breath, to learn about the devotional energy and impetus of the work through embodying it. I made a sung citation of the composition in a performance to camera work, and I named the work In Training for the Horror. The title named the feeling I got from listening to Eastman's extended pieces for 4 pianos. Recently, I was commissioned to write a response to a conversation between Trinidadian poet Varney Capildeo and American choreographer Simone Forti, which was part of the Performance Poetry's event at the Henry Moore Institute. Through this project, I learned about Capildeo's workshop exercise they call sitting with difficulty or sitting with discomfort. The process involves reading selected texts that express heavy subjects like, for example, violence and racism, and reading them slowly and repeatedly in small groups. Through these cycles of slowed repetition, you then make a somatic map of the readers' and listeners' responses on the text itself. Observing exhalations, weights or tensions in the body perhaps, changes in temperature, tightness, looseness, a change in pulse. And these somatic readings then become part of a formal analysis of the work. listening to the extraordinary Elaine Michener perform Eastman's Stay On It at Jupiter Artland in 2019, big fat tears rolled down my cheeks, despite or maybe encouraged by the absurdity of the Artland surroundings. Michener's performances of Eastman's music and in general leave you no other option. Sucked in, fleeting, four on the floor type feelings, grounded, fixed to, zoomed in, proper liveness, extra'd through improvisation. I haven't stopped talking about an evening of performances by Michener and the band Schiefer, who are Pat Thomas, Mark Sanders and Rachel Meeson, which took place at Dartington Hall in Devon in November last year. And it was part of a Sensing the Planet Symposium that focused on racial climate justice. Watching those performances made me feel so peaceful, not content, but like really energized in a peaceful way, maybe like open. I felt more open. Watching people improvise with the instrument or their voice and with others and in response to the energy of an audience is, for me, like watching an extreme or radical kind of intimacy. Witnessing trust and risk and connection. It's the blueprint for really good listening with self and others. And really good listening is a fundamental element in understanding and recalibrating to intersectional oppressions. Jumping back again into June 2021, and I'm lying on the carpeted floor of the shared studio office spare room of my previous home, listening to Eastman's music whilst on a group Zoom call with other staff and PhD students from the University of Leeds. It was a weekly Wednesday morning session with the Race and Racism Module Working Group. A group I convened with the wonderful Maki Fukuoka and Helen Graham, actual friends I made in HE. Maki and Helen and I organised together between 2019 and 2021 across our different contextual privileges to focus on the racisms, and in particular the anti-Black racism that is baked into, like most majority white-led institutions, the structures of Leeds University. Our activities included circle-way reading groups of Layla Al-Side's Me and My White Supremacy, film groups, an absolutely amazing student-led decolonization project initiated and conceptualized by Zipporah Blake-Wave-Zande and Carmen Akome called Buyer's Remorse. Check it out, it's all still online. And this module working group of staff members, not just academics, that wanted to co-write a module that focused on race and racism, and that all students would engage with across fine art, history of art, and cultural studies. A vital focus for cultural producers of various sorts, to sensitize, touch, use, and dissemination of things, people, and ideas. And I know that the group is still ongoing and developing. Part of this working group's agenda was to share resources that affected our individual understandings of race and racism. I shared a section of Eastman's music, that same piece from the Artless film, third part of the third measure, a work which radically illuminates constructions of race and racism across contexts and in intersection with sexuality through sound, form, and language. The learning is in the listening, in the presence the work requires of me, and then via further study and research in the expanded sense of the word. And whilst, as discussed, I'm struck and moved by Eastman's insistent intention to confront audiences with racialized language and politics, in certain works in particular, and as is described as a process of detoxification by Rennie Levine-Packer, I guess it's important that we pay careful attention to the context in which his work is presented, to make the necessary negotiations and conditions for the work and the reception of the work. And because broadly, universities are extractive, they gain in relation to research. And I'm particularly talking about the Academy's historic and contemporary research into race and issues of migration, which in my experience is processed through a practice of methodological whiteness. This is a term from Gurminder Bahar, and which I came across in the Border Abolition Conference 2021. It's defined as the way in which knowledge in a Western framework is constructed and legitimized through colonized thought and white supremacy. Add this to the fact that individual and community experiences of oppression and minoritization, which often occur through processes of racialization, are frequently researched in the academy by researchers who have no lived or ancestral connection to that subject matter, which produces faulty knowledges and continues to exploit their subjects of study. Redistribution is needed. And as some of us know, Eastman's relationship to academia in the US and the scene in general during his lifetime was fraught by the racialized and homophobic logics of the institution, repressive, heteronormative, white supremacist conditions. From my own positionality, I spent much of my time at the University of Leeds feeling angry and isolated due to all the systemic isms, and then suppressing those feelings to enable anti-racist organising, which was my choice to engage with, although in that particular context, I felt like I had little choice. In writing this section of the text, I begin to feel those feelings flood over me. And so, at this point in writing, and as a reminder to myself when reading this aloud, I want to call in the text and practice Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love and Liberation by Angel Kyodo Williams and Lama Rod Owens, which was gifted to me as a leaver present from Leeds by my friend Mackie, precisely because of Eastman's spiritual outlook and connection to Buddhist precepts. I'm new to the text and have been reading it in fits and starts, alongside Bell's hooks all about love. So I'm reminding myself now to loosen my jaw and re-center this last section of my text with a loving intention. As Eastman says, right thought, speech, and action, no other thing is as important or useful. Right thought, right speech, right action, right music. So with that, I return to the statement that accompanies this event to refocus our attention on the question, how can it be ensured that the institution, this one now I'm talking about, isn't still extracting from Eastman, but in real terms attending to his legacy? And which leads me to consider the student musicians who performed some of Eastman's work in the concert last weekend, which was so brilliant to see. I wondered what pedagogy supported their experience, pre and post that direct pedagogic contact with Eastman's school. Beyond this conference, what specific pedagogy for students and staff is accompanying the otolith film whilst it's on show at the university? And because while opportunities like the Symposium are rich and stimulating, they're not always accessible to all. Some unraveling and translation is needed. How are elements of this conference going to slip into the wider culture of consciousness of this majority white-led institution and become an ongoing conversation? And as part of this work, what consideration is being given to the small number of Black students in the school in supporting their relations with Eastman's work and amongst their peers? And how is that support being guided by those with the relevant lived experience? And what conversations have been organised between this Staging Eastman programme and the active anti-racist organising in the school? That one seems to be a no-brainer, though it would need to be done with an awareness of who this labour falls to and how it is, or more precisely isn't, accounted for within contracted hours. The occasion of Eastman's work in contact with the university provides a major opportunity to, as Eastman wrote on his application form to study at the Curtis Institute of Music, to gain wisdom. One that I also recognise needs to be resourced and resourced rightly to be fully realised. In some roundabout way, I hope my presentation has indicated ways in which I attempt to learn from, connect to, and share the energy of Eastman's work in my own practices. And as well, left the space open for the University of Leeds to think deeply about how this Staging Eastman event can continue to tune or attune the racial consciousness of the school.
Thank you very much, Nicola. You've given us a lot to think about, as you always do. And so let us hold it. We'll come next to Dan and then back around. I'd like to also give Kojo and Angelika a chance to engage this if they would like at the end of what Dan has brought for us to think about. Please, Dan.
Cool. I hope I'm audible.
You are?
Cool. Right. Thanks, Nicola. Actually, there's a lot there that I can spin off. I just kind of threw some notes together this morning, and I think the way you've given a kind of account of your listening, as well as thinking about the relationship between groove and institution, something that kind of comes up in my own listening of Eastman. So yeah, I was actually introduced to Eastman by Kojo in the early 2010s, I think, where he was kind of pressing the Unjust Malays collection into my hand, you know, and urging me to listen to it. And so it really came as no surprise, actually, when he and Angelika told some of us during the break of that performance at LCMF in 2016 that they were putting together, assembling a film of the composer. And it's actually even more apt that the next stage in this particular circuit of encounters with Eastman was seeing the third part of the third measure at Corsica Studios in June 2017, where it was screened as part of Hyperdub's monthly Zero dances, which took place at that venue. And so I'd actually like to use that occasion of the Zero screening, the kind of Hyperdub hosted event, to, like Nicola, put some propositions into the mix that we can perhaps discuss alongside and with hers. So as far as I understand it, and I saw the work on that occasion first time at Corsica, and Sam was kind enough to let me into the screening room, the project space in the School of Fine Art and Cultural Studies to engage with it again yesterday, to refresh my memory. But as far as I understand it, the work of the third part, and I'll call it that because I'll inevitably trip over the title, is to contend with three things. A is the actual output of Eastman as a composer, so with the musicians playing his piece. B, the idea of Eastman, and C, this notion of institutional Eastmania. So the film for me seems to be kind of contending with these three things. Both Angelika and Kojo, as well as George Lewis, have spoken about these dimensions of the film on several occasions. I recall, I didn't get a chance to re-engage with it, but the occasion where you screened it in New York and had a discussion about it, and these themes seem to come up. And no, Angelika Kojo, as well as George Lewis, have sought to stress how the film deals with the stakes of Eastman's return in our present and the material reality of his aesthetic project, like the actual music he composed, the actual music he made. And you know, they talk about the film as an experience of watching in the key of listening, which kind of speaks to how they're trying to drill down into that particular dynamic. And Kojo and Lewis have actually addressed these dimensions in print in that collection of essays published by Savvy Contemporary in 2020. And in their respective pieces, they both appear to be grappling with this kind of notion of a Black avant-garde. And I'm sure I'm doing huge violence to their arguments here. But just to briefly summarize for those who haven't read the collection as yet, there's a kind of, I think they both seem to point to this unstable dialectic in the film, or an unstable dialectic which the film serves to illuminate, rather. On the one hand, you have Eastman, who's symbolic of a perpetual forgetting of a Black avant-garde. And yet simultaneously, you have this frenzy of Eastmania of the past 4 years or so, which has kind of constructed Eastman as an exceptional singular figure, an institutional process, which actually all it does is secure the structural whiteness of the avant-garde in both past and present, right? So this kind of Eastmania, which picks out Eastman as this singular exceptional figure and kind of rips him out of the worlds in which he existed in. And both Lewis and Kojo's essays rest to a certain degree on a quote from Fred Moten regarding the oxymoronic existence of the Black avant-garde. And they use this to speak to the difficulty and challenge Eastman poses to avant-gardes in his moment and avant-gardes in our moment, and particularly the racial composition of those avant-gardes. But I think actually there's an alternate way to read that line from that Moten quote, particularly where he talks about the avant-garde as necessarily not Black. I think there's a different way to break Moten's thinking open, to break into it. And I think it can set up another type of encounter with Eastman, both in his present and in our own present. And so I'd just like to kind of try that out, with you and see where we go with it. And this breaking up of Moten, this breaking up of the FM signal, this kind of pirate interruption of it, as another way of listening to Eastman, I think rests on a set of propositions that I like to put out. In the case of the idea of Eastman, I think what if it is the very idea of the avant-garde that's proving to be a kind of blockage here, right? Does the term avant-garde, whether it's Black, necessarily not Black, white, or otherwise, does it adequately account for the types of experimentation Eastman was conducting in his moment and the future possibilities for experimentation that he was speculating on? And what else becomes audible if we tune into Eastman without the policing nuisance of an avant-garde? As I've always thought, the avant-garde kind of comes in a certain type of uniform, which, some of us run to, some of us run away from. So I'd like to kind of take two very quick, minor, partial, kind of exploratory inroads into these propositions. And they're no means definitive or the only ones available, but they're just kind of to give you a hint of the type of examples or instances I have in mind. The first is, I think, a contemporary of Eastman's, actually, someone who we would describe as a composer, and was also looking to explore a new dynamics of sound as a kind of modality of sensual poetics. And the person I have in mind is Barry Eugene Carter, or more commonly known by his artist name, Barry White. He's undeniably a composer. White had his own ensemble, the Love Unlimited Orchestra. And George Lewis described Eastman's music as possessive of, quote, a spirit of audible and sensuous adventure. And I think you can hear a kinship between Eastman and Barry White along those lines, along this sense of audible and sensuous adventure. If, as the recording of Stay On It presented on the Unjust Malaise collection, as it starts to come to a close, and you hear this kind of sound of a tambourine being shaken, you begin to fade in the opening bars of Barry White's Never Gonna Give You Up from his 1972 album, Stone Gone. I think you can start to blend the two and you hear a kind of kinship, and it was made in the same space and time, the similar conjuncture. Secondly, one of the other claims at the heart of the third part is that Eastman was looking to speculate on an alternate set of social conditions, which might have been more hospitable to his aesthetic project. And he did this by generating a type of music which is too alien and too militant for the conjuncture in which he operated. And that was a particular guerrilla strategy at work in his sound. That was the kind of particular guerrilla nature that he was trying to feed into his project. And if we survey our current moment in the sound world we're in now, I think we find numerous guerrilla composers who are at home in that future world Eastman was trying to project. And in his essay in the Savvy Contemporary collection, Kojo writes, this is a quote, of the insistent joy of the hammered piano riffs of Evil N, 1979, as gentle as rain, yet as persistent as galloping hooves. And I think if you play Evil N alongside or through Composition 5 from Enkisi's 2019 album, Seven Directions, I suggest we hear a similar kinship, a similar kind of strain of insistence, tenderness, and persistence being extended, reconstituted, and redeployed. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that for Barry White, or Barry Eugene Carter, as a contemporary of Eastman's, and Enkisi as our contemporaries and one of Eastman's guerrillas, the avant-garde never comes into the picture. Okay, the avant-garde is not a problem for them to be overcome because it doesn't carry any weight in their sound worlds. Okay, White, Enkisi, and hundreds of other composers like them, in their time and ours, are committed to an intensity of experimentation with the sound of music as a social fabric in a way that exists on its own alternative terms and can sustain itself by other means without the need for an avant-garde. And I think if we kind of listen to Eastman through these types of composers, we realize that his relationship to the avant-garde might have been at best to, I think using one of Nicola's terms, to decompose and redistribute it. But it's also, I think, much more than that. And I think if I get the feeling if we get hung up on the avant-garde question too much, we miss out on a lot of what's possible to hear in Eastman's music. And I'll leave it there for now, because I think we should, have a chat about all these things.
Fantastic, thanks very much. The promise I made earlier was to invite Kojo and Anjali to engage any or all of what's been said, if you would like.
Kojo, do you want to go first or what?
Do you want to go first? So much to say, so much to respond to.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I just wanted to say I really enjoyed your response, Nicola. Thank you for that. It was very beautiful, very inspiring. And I was drawn to a lot of things I've been thinking around in relation to, let's say, philosophical South Asian philosophy when it comes to thinking around the senses in a non-binary universe and dualism, anti-dualistic kind of practices as a kind of way of, I mean, this is very much, I think, when Eastman's interest in Buddhism, I think, stems from a lot of that. But I just also wanted to kind of, I'm glad you brought his Buddhist and his Buddhist ideas and spiritual kind of thinking into this. I also feel that when you described how you felt about listening to Eastman, it was beautiful to hear how that immediately made you feel about, you know, the kind of structural racism that's kind of on repeat in multiple kind of sites of education in relation to kind of whiteness's infrastructure. And the call that you've made to the University of Leeds to think about how Eastman's work can begin to help to, you know, deprogram or decolonize, you know, their kind of the frequencies of their worlds that they are kind of so used to, of speaking in and about, when it comes to speaking in and about Blackness. I think and it made me think when you were talking about, when you gave your talk, it's about how much is drawn from absence and how much value is drawn from absence and how much value is drawn from giving people of color, Black people, Black musicians, the space to speak, as if that is, you know, enough. I think, you know, it's just, it's at the same time very beautiful the way you articulated many of these things, but kind of desperately upsetting as well, because one realizes that there is just this kind of endless repeat going from Eastman's generation to mine to yours. So it's kind of exhausting and upsetting that this continues, especially in the face of the incredible work and thinking that is, you know, that's coming out of, I would say, a Black avant-garde of thinkers and writers. And when I say Black, I mean Black and Asian, from a very British perspective. When I say Black, I mean Black and Asian. You know, I think this relationship that Eastman has, to go to Danveer's point about the avant-garde, and I'm not going to get into it too much because it's, you know, I want to hear what Koja has to say as well. But having worked within the classical schools and having created ensembles previous to Otolith Group, and worked within music and staging different musics and live performances, when Black musicians play classical music, there's something very, it starts to really, it begins to make people feel very uncomfortable. And I think and the schools do not support, the classical schools do not support this young musicians of color. It's still a very difficult space. And I think that, you know, for me, Eastman is fighting this system, and maybe that sounds obvious, but he's fighting it from a perspective of written music. And George says, you know, in the essay on in our book on, you know, on this film, you know, he says that he talks a lot about scores, and he talks about, you know, Eastman. He says Eastman has written this work for historically imprinted bodies, which participate in a further transformation towards a Black liveness that defies the assumption that Afro-diasporic music is ineluctably either improvised or performed from mental memory. As centuries of classical music commentary has forcefully asserted. However, the music's emergence from a dialectic with notation means that this evil N-word music comes from a Black mind body which extends to the performers of the work. So I just wanted to, I'm not doing justice to Nicola's beautiful presentation, but I, you know, because it's still making me think about lots of different things. But in relation to the idea of the avant-garde or a Black avant-garde, maybe there's no need to see it as an avant-garde in that it's always been there. But, you know, I think what Eastman does is he condenses his references, untether. He does a kind of temporal deprogramming through a sonic untethering from racial capitalism's constructions and categories of culture. And he unearths things into this highly sophisticated space, which ranges from beautiful fury to beautiful, all kinds of different states of vocality. So, I mean, I think all I just wanted to say was that his fight within the classical schools, in the new music school, his fight, you know, matters, and it mattered that he continues, that you know, we can't just pretend that his fight with this idea of the avant-garde isn't important. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to be sure that you had a chance to say what you wanted to say there. Kojo, do you want to engage from there, or? you deferred initially, so I just want to give you a chance to come back in if you'd like.
I mean, there's so much that's been said. I'm still trying to compose a response. Maybe we could all have a conversation, and that will help me to compose a response.
But it's funny because I was thinking a lot about Barry White in the last 2 days, so I don't really know why.
I mean, I enjoyed both papers, both presentations tremendously, and I learned a huge amount. And that's precisely why I need a bit of time, not like endless time, but a bit of time to compose a response that in a way, at least tries to respond in the spirit of the proposals and propositions put on the table by Nicola and by Danveer. So maybe we could open it out into a general conversation, and then a bit further into our conversation, I can come back with a more considered response.
Well, then let us add some more responders to the call. Looks like, Sam, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's just a shorter response. Thank you so much for those really special responses, Nicola and Danveer. It's quite moving in lots of different ways to kind of continue the idea of mobility, and when the fact here, Nicola, and I almost had a similar kind of feeling about your time, and within the school with us, and the sadness of your departure. But I also think that there's something I wanted to pick up on your talk, radical intimacy, which is something I wrote down, which to me resonated with an idea not of the evil end, but of gay guerrilla, which is kind of explained within Eastman's text as a kind of dialectical thing that maybe confounds the expectations we might have of gayness, or I suppose what we would now call kind of queer perspective, and that he was maybe looking forward to the possibility of a kind of antagonistic, active form of gayness, and I think in terms of this idea of radical intimacy, I think it's played out very well in the third part, because what I kind of intimated early on about this idea of, I don't think it's voyeuristic, because I've spent a lot of my life as an artist, like putting cameras, in the faces of various performers, Elaine, one of which many times, and then there's constantly this struggle of exposure, in all its kind of registers. And but I think there's something that happens with, and maybe it is the kind of multiplicity or the proliferation of kind of viewpoints and instruments that somehow destabilizes some of these traditional kind of hierarchies in relationship to the composer, the performer, the filmmaker, and etc. These things, and when the Otolith were talking about the idea of it being kind of almost like the filmmakers being performers, I found that very exciting, and I know that's something that would really resonate with you, Nicola, as an artist, and I think that's something I want to think about. But also, finally, with radical intimacy, something about listening, as kind of touched upon by Jean-Luc Nancy, that somehow to be listening, or to be in listening, is to always already being kind of outward and shared, and there's this centrifugal. So I always get centripetal and centrifugal mixed up, but the centrifugal idea of this work, and that is kind of doubled by David Borden's reading of this kind of orbits and expansion going on, and I think that's really felt within the installation. That there's an intimacy to everything, but there's also things kind of exploding outwards in challenging hierarchies along the way. So yeah, I mean, it's not really a question, just a kind of a little bit of response, but there are many things I could kind of bring out, but I think that idea of radical intimacy is something that I want to hold on to and try and kind of keep thinking about.
Nicola, did you want to pick up any of that and go with it somewhere?
I feel like I've spoken quite a lot, so
Okay.
I'd rather, yeah.
Let me fill the void for a second. So I want to come back to you, Danveer. I mean, I'm trying to get a sense now of what's at stake in abandoning, suspending, deconstructing the avant-garde. I took you to be arguing that if we listened to things that are going on in Barry White or things that are going on in Eastman, we note that there is some kind of commonality, some sort of a similarity that's happening, and that the notion of identifying it as a particular musicologically recognizable identity is not helpful to hearing that, to actually listening to what is in common. Is that the issue in a way? In other words, that we need to stop worrying about whether the sounds are, doing something that aligns them with a particular kind of movement or description, and listen in the sense of sort of suspending the impulse to think about what they do and think more in terms of what they are, what's happening.
Yeah, kind of in that way. Yeah, like what happens if from a certain time period and a certain location you place two things next to each other that weren't supposed to, and actually you hear a great deal of resonance, even if that resonance is a kind of resonance in dissonance. It does have some dissonance. I'm not saying they sound exactly the same, but I think there's something at work there. And if a better way to think about it is, I think, so there's just before in the US South, before what came known as the civil rights movement kind of kicked into gear, or just as it was kicking into gear, you had a series of Black freedom schools that were set up by African Americans in the South to provide children with a form of militant education, but also the education they weren't able to receive in segregated schools. And then when the plan was hatched to start to publicly try to desegregate schools, people who ran freedom schools, the pupils in them got together and decided, well, before we begin this thing, let's work out what it is we want. And in some of the documentation, if I can't recall the details of it where you can dig it out, but if someone does happen to find it, they put together a set of statements and a set of manifestos. And the first thing they said was all, yes, we want to desegregate public schools, but let's not lose what we already have. And I think you could think about that as if you think about desegregation as that sort of project, not by saying, okay, an institution has something that we are in need of, but simply it's a set of resources that we can make use of, but we don't want to lose something that we've already built. You could think about that as a kind of militant kind of deprovincialization. And I think if you I get the sense that Eastman's, Kojo and Angelica would have studied him a lot deeper than I, but just from my own listening, but just from my own listening, that's what it sounds like to me: a militant deprovincialization of the avant-garde, not an attempt to build a Black avant-garde, but a militant deprovincialization of its idea. And that gets set off if you hear that through someone like White and then through someone like Nkisi.
Yeah.
But I think making a claim on a Black avant-garde, I think, has all sorts of obvious class problems. And I think we need to have a commitment to a class project as well as a race project. Otherwise, we're gonna fight a losing battle.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think a lot of things you say are right, but maybe for slightly different reasons. Like that when you put Blackness and avant-garde together, that's not an easy fit. Like the destabilization is already at work from the outset. Another way of putting this is that there was a moment in the Eastman Symposium at Savvy where Josh Kuhn played Fatback Band and Stay On It. And he mixed them together, and it worked as a mix. It was really compelling. In fact, it had this kind of illuminating quality in the same way, in a way that resonates with the way you drew out the relation between Barry White, Never Gonna Give You Up, and Stay On It. And those two moments between Barry White as a contemporary of Eastman and Nkisi as a contemporary guerrilla composer working in the future that Eastman sets up. I think those are extremely compelling formulations to do with what you call the policing function of the avant-garde. I guess, the reason why this question engaged us is not because, I don't think it's because of a kind of, an over-identification with a notion of an avant-garde. It's more because of the question of asking the question that you pointed to, which is, why are these two things not supposed to go together? Why is Barry White and Eastman not supposed to go together? That the prestige economy of minimalism, the prestige economy of avant-garde, it cannot be wished away by it can be materially decomposed in the mix, but it can't be institutionally wished away. And the question is, what do we do with the fact that Eastman situated himself within these fields, that Eastman got into Curtis Institute, which turned down Eunice Wayman. Eunice Wayman became Nina Simone, 7 years younger than Eastman. Eunice Wayman born in 1933, Eastman born in 1940. So in those 7 years, something happened. Eunice Wayman was just as talented, just as brilliant, a child genius. They both were. She's refused outright and becomes the Nina Simone that we know, but clearly bears the scars of that refusal. In one reading, that was the best thing that ever happened to her, but she wouldn't recognize that. She would not say that. When you listen to Nina Simone singing, Isn't It a Pity? That sounds like she's singing about love and life. Maybe she's singing about that childhood rejection. Like, isn't it a pity that I didn't get into the Curtis Institute? But Eastman did, and went through those ranks, and then into Buffalo, where he worked with a whole lot of white composers, none of which we remember now, except for the fact that they were friends with Eastman. That hurts them because they thought they were who was important. We know better. So I guess the historical fact of Eastman's investment in these particular new music scenes is something we have to engage with. The fact that Eastman situated so much of his time in works that had vanishingly little popular audience or Black audiences or Black interpretive communities around them. What do we do with that? So it's the mixture between a sonic gesture which decomposes and a kind of historical encounter which recognizes what Eastman's formation was and what we do with that. There was a way in which we can read that as a kind of pathos. This is George Lewis's point, the pathos of the Black composer, rejected by the Black working classes for not being popular enough, but also rejected by the Black avant-garde intelligentsia, the Black arts movement era, also rejected by them for being effectively traitors to a certain ethos of rebuilding the spirit and the ethos of Black art. So there's a certain way in which Eastman inherits that pathos, which George Lewis, in a way, understands very well. And it's part of the power of his AACM book that he speaks to that pathos of the composer, the Black composer. And there is, as Black artists working in moving image, there is, what is driving that essay is the sense that the policing function of the avant-garde is actually is, as we say, it's not only policing, it's actually it's actually actively working to foreclose and disavow. It's an actual work of erasure. It's a project of erasure. So on one hand, your reading is deeply compelling. On the other hand, we still have to reckon with what Eastman reckoned with. That is the difference between a kind of sonically remixing project and a kind of project which deals with the historical weight of what he was doing. So that's my initial thinking, and then actually maybe we can leave it there, and then I can come back to Nicola as in her own right, in response to her own thinking separately.
But I wanted to kind of draw upon the Dartington experience, because of course we were there, and I remember you being there. And there were two very different events, musical events, that happened at that space. It was curated by Serpentine and that guy called Ash. I can't remember his name, but I found the divide between those two performances so great, and so they both kind of, one was a sort of ritualistic gathering of musicians and non-musicians performing, I would say, like a kind of gathering of spiritual songs or songs that's, that Barbie Asante, who I've known for like 25 years, sort of put together. I'm going to be very honest, I didn't like it at all. I found it performed to every cliche in the book of, what is expected, or by, it didn't move me at all, do anything to me. In fact, it made me furious, but I'm kind of glad she did it, because it made me furious. It definitely elicited a response. Later, when Elaine and Mark and Pat played, I was immediately thrown into a state of being in a kind of space of just feeling multiple questions that none of them could settle on a response. and the questions were in a dynamic flow with everything that you kind of, it was almost like, yeah, I mean, it was a very powerful series of sequences of music that they all played together that was diametrically opposed to the, I would say, the lack of complexity that was, you know, there really in relation to the works of art as such that were being screened or being or performed. It was all about some kind of amelioration, and I think that Kojo's right. Those musicians, you know, people like Eastman, and I would also say Pat Thomas and that ensemble that evening, also they continue to produce this uncomfortable feeling, which I think cuts across class, you know, expectations of what Black musicians are supposed to be able to do if they're from a working class background. Certainly Pat Thomas, I mean, certainly I'm not going to talk about that because Elaine is here as well, but I know that, you know, everybody's background in that ensemble is complicated. So, you know, I think Eastman's, I agree with Kojo just in relation to the, I like that uncomfortable feeling that is produced. I think it's like a kind of new weapon almost against being kind of captured.
The feeling of discomfort itself is this sort of a weapon.
Sorry?
I'm just trying to follow what becomes the weapon. It's the feeling of discomfort or
It's
producing.
yes, it's the dissonance, it's the anger, it's the rage, it's multiple different experiences, it's the references that are all kind of within Eastman's work, yeah, that are, it is a series of, yeah, just untetherings to kind of expectations, but then absolute like meditations of forms of untethering with music. I think that he was a furious character, you know, Eastman was furious and he was disturbed by any kind of desire to put him in a box. So he was queering many different, you know, when he talks about gay guerrillas and he talks about Afghani guerrillas and he talks about the potential for gay guerrillas to be as powerful as Afghani guerrillas or Palestinian guerrillas. I mean, I love that because he's bringing a kind of solidarity between guerrillas, guerrilladom, you know, into gaydom. And when you could see, I mean, this was very influential on the kind of construction of the piece in terms of how we shot it. Was his queering of it's, that's why we use light in that way, because, and all the shots in all these different angles, because he constantly turns this thing called his work. He constantly, in each composition, he's turning it. He doesn't let you settle, you know. It's the same as Elaine, who's here, but with her camera off. We went to see her at the Wigmore Hall perform a piece of work, which I cannot remember the title right now. But again, she was turning this, she was turning almost like this sculptural piece of sonic references, which are, when Elaine said earlier, it's work, it's hard work. It is hard work. I don't think one can be lazy when it comes to thinking about what you make, what a kind of Black aesthetic is right now that is dealing with justice. That how can you do aesthetic justice to blackness.
Is it okay if I jump in, John? Back in?
Of course.
Yeah, just to kind of riff off both Kojo and Anjali. I think actually something that struck me the first time I saw the film is the way I think it speaks to a conversation in diasporic filmmaking as well, and a set of debates in diasporic filmmaking. And certainly, let's say, you know, the line in Paul Gilroy's essay on the Black Audio Film Collective's Handsworth Songs, where he says, you know, well, where is the Black audience for this film, and his claims around popular modernism. I think the film is kind of reconvening that set of debates, and I think that's precisely why I pointed to Nkisi as well as Barry White. I think in a certain moment in the mid-70s, that was a huge tension.
Yeah.
It was a tension which, you know, you found played out in the fact that Herbie Hancock decides to make Headhunters, or Miles Davis decides to make On the Corner, right? Or you know, Mtume makes a certain move, you know, passed recently. But what we get now in our contemporary, in our current moment, is, as I stressed, a set of composers who don't seem to occupy that tension. Whether it's Nkisi, whether it's Klein, whether it's Dean Blunt, whether it's Jana Rush, you're getting a different order of compositions. So I think a different mode of composition, which doesn't fall into those traps, I think, and occupies the same difficulty, a similar difficulty, not the same, because it wouldn't be the same, the similar difficulty that Eastman's work poses. I mean, I think you know, Kojo and George both deal with it in their essay. Like, I'm not looking to play the role of Baraka here, right? But what I'm asking is, how do we ensure the film doesn't reconstitute an idea of a Black avant-garde? That's what I'm asking, because I think the film is posing that challenge, saying that the Black avant-garde needs to be something different, or if a Black avant-garde needs to perhaps decompose an idea of the avant, because that seemed to be the thing that killed him, right? I recall, and I have to admit, I was kind of weirded out by it in the New York screening, where George told a story of passing Eastman on the street when he was like living rough in Tompkins Square Park and asking him for change. And I found that really strange and disturbing as a story of a Black avant-garde, right? Of two instances of Black avant-gardes passing each other on the street, and one's begging for change. You know, that, so if it was the thing that killed him, the thing that destroyed him, that meant he lived his life out the way he did, then clearly that's a problem, right? Clearly that's a problem. And a lesson we might learn from Eastman is we have to take apart, or just do without this thing called an avant-garde, right? Perhaps that was a thing that, you know, that didn't allow him to flourish. You can have that music without an avant-garde. Right, you can have that. You know, it was John Cage who went crazy, didn't he, and kind of tried to cut him out completely of all the institutional access, because Eastman dared to explicitly talk about queer sex practices on stage as a way to kind of out Cage. That's a level of violence that, you know, he shouldn't have had to live with. I think the film poses those questions, but I'm interested in drawing those questions out, as Nicola did.
Okay. Right. Can I just jump in with your reference to Black audio and diasporic filmmaking? Black audio were told that their work was too complicated, too avant-garde. Not avant-garde. I don't really know if people use those actual terms, but they were definitely seen as too French, let's say, or too experimental for kind of Black people in Britain, that their work was too complex. We get attacked for that as well. We get called by other Black famous artists and theorists, that we don't, that the work is, it's not all, it's peripatetic, or it's, the work doesn't fulfill people's idea of what black practice is, because it's we're making work about radiation, or earthquake sensitives, or John Cherry, or Etel Adnan, or Tagore, and this kind of seems to upset the idea of what people expect of a black practice. They, I think Britain is very good at kind of limiting what is considered to be a black practice by the kind of endless repetition of, a kind of Steve McQueen-esque kind of Steve McQueen's work, endless repetition. How many black filmmakers are there in the UK since Steve McQueen, who might be experimental? So while I like some of Steve McQueen's artwork, I'm not so fond of his TV stuff and Hollywood stuff. I just, it always reminds me, when I'm always thinking of that the way that Black Audio's work didn't sit comfortably with people like Paul Gilroy, like you mentioned earlier. So, because they wanted to include, say, opera in their work, or they wanted to have different textures and feelings in their montage that were not supposed to be there. So, I don't want to also take that away from, for me, the avant-garde, this question of the avant-garde is not one that has been, it is something that has been completely extracted from people who have been at the forefront, of thinking, or of revolutions, or of struggles, or of music practices. So I think one also needs to think that again, and that's what Eastman asks us to do. I don't think one needs to take it away.
Are we hearing the locality of what Eastman is actually saying directly about the proliferation of ends, the fundamental, stripping down to these different figures you're supposed to be? And I suppose every time you even look in the program, or this music's performed, these things are kind of coming back at you. They're kind of still there, like the echoes of these kind of characters. And the idea of the black avant-garde plays into some of those stereotypes, kind of invertly, or what have you.
I think this story Danvir tells about Julius Eastman and George Lewis passing each other does speak to the punitive and disciplining and ongoing violence of a certain institutional apparatus, which we can call the avant-garde. And what I appreciate in Nicola's talk is the way in which the effective encounter with Eastman through third part is then carried over into a widespread confrontation with the academy, and simultaneously a reckoning with the resources, necessity to navigate it, to survive it, and then to live in it and through it and beyond it, so that Eastman's music itself becomes the resource. It becomes a resource both in when Nicola draws attention to this term, this brilliant phrase, attention is the highest form of prayer.
Mm.
And when she draws attention to this, also this brilliant phrase, the learning is in the listening. And also the emphasis on somatic mapping and exhalation, which I think we can relate to Isaac's reading of Ashon Crawley's Black Pentecostal Breath, which is a brilliant accounting of breath and noise in the context of a kind of theological otherwise, a Black Pentecostal otherwise. And I think I heard Nicholas say that that listening over and over to Eastman's prelude to the Holy Presence of Joan of Arc could be understood as a training for the horror. I don't know if I misheard you or if you said entrainment for the horror, but certainly I think of Eastman's music as a kind of I think of it as a kind of as a mode which imminently draws you into its own way of giving you a certain amount of confidence, a certain amount of belief. It's like it's its own immanence. It's an immanence. The more you listen to it, the more you get from it. That's why you need to pass it on.
Yeah.
That's why it makes you into a kind of a permanent persuader. That's why it makes you into a passionate proselytizer.
Yeah.
It's why you just want to tell people about it, because you want to build some kind of community around it. So it has some kind of socializing force which reaches out and demands a kind of an effective proximity and intimacy to people.
It really does.
And for me, it speaks. So then, just to respond once more to Danvir's compelling points, like there's a way in which, when you put Black next to avant-garde, Blackness is decomposing avant-garde. It's not the prefix to the suffix avant-garde. There's a way in which it's undermining it. So there's a way in which, so there is something oxymoronic about the term, and and this oxymoronic catachristic dimension is not to be resolved, but to be amplified. It's not that you're resolving Black avant-garde in the name of a higher synthesis. It's the opposite. You're using Blackness to create a friction which disturbs whatever self-satisfaction the prestige of the term avant-garde has. And I think in Moten's argument, it's part of this larger argument about the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition. But for us, it's a question of, what do you do with unpopular Black music? What do you do with it? What do you do with, we could say that we live in a time in which, like, whenever there is, Greg Tate said to us in Philadelphia, he said, I'm not going to do Greg Tate's accent, but he said, when there's trouble on the streets, they come looking for our avant-garde. And he meant Black avant-garde. And so we were saying, what is this East Mania about? And that was Greg's That was Greg's response to it. And he said it in his low-key way. But there's also a way in which I think, could we also say that like after periods of widespread social political uprising, the appetite for difficulty increases. It's not that in an emergency people want forms of certainty. It's the other way around. It's people, well, I'm not saying what people want, I'm just saying I have the sense that in the social energy unleashed and articulated by Black Lives Matter, the desire is not for forms of certainty. The desire is for forms that speak to a certain, speak to the seriousness, speak to the dilemmas that so many Black and peoples of color communities find themselves in, that speak to the actual terms of the predicament, that speak to the actual conditions of existence. And under those conditions, what would have been unpopular in another era becomes massively popular. So people's desire for experimentation goes up massively. People won't settle for less. So under those conditions, the question of the avant-garde is less important than the question of what Moten is calling the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition, like what those are. So any artist who can speak to, who can aesthetically do justice to the really existing terms of the problems that people face will resonate with them, and that work will move the border on what was unpopular. So to me the main concern is this question of what to do with Black unpopular culture, what to do with Black unpopular music. Sometimes Black unpopular music, which is so unpopular, it seems to draw as much on noise, and it also seems to draw just as importantly on a certain degree of unblackness. Like it doesn't appear, you can't quite get a grip on the kind of the forms of certainty of its racialization. And under conditions of crisis, people are fine with that. Like people stop policing un-Black, unpopular, un-music. They don't like punish it. It nurtures people because it speaks to the actual turmoil that is actually existent. The perspective dimension, because it's about what Blackness is becoming. It's Blackness in its undergoing mutation, And so could it be that Eastman's music speaks to this conjuncture? And this conjuncture is the question of the avant-garde is only a moment in a larger question. I think, to do with the stakes of the popular. And the popular, as we know, is a question of desire, yearning, and what is present and perspective at the same time. Now I'm rambling, but I'm just thinking aloud, trying to get my head around these compelling questions that you've brought into our discussion.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to at least see whether anyone in our audience would like to join the conversation. I think all that would be required would be either something in the chat or a hand. Not seeing anything. In which case,
John?
yes. Oh, please.
I can, yeah.
Please. Couldn't see you.
I was just thinking about another way to be having this conversation about the avant-garde and how useful or not it is, would be to listen to Danveer remix Eastman into Barry White over and over again and do some somatic mapping of that, because you know that's the kind of training or like, you know, like consequence effect of listening to Eastman's work that I think we're all talking about in different ways, which I was calling for more as a pedagogy in higher education or like between people. And I just wanted to also bring in something that Elaine Mitchner said from the earlier talk about how freeing improvisation is and feels for Elaine, and how much hard work it is as well. And I actually don't know where I'm going with that, apart from like adding another call for improvisation in higher education, like in its various forms, and recognizing the kind of conditions and support we need around ourselves and for others to improvise. And I think, like, I hope that makes sense, because I do really mean that.
Right. Well, I do know from a conversation of my own with Danveer that one of his approaches to pedagogy, in fact, involves getting students to sort of read in one hand and listen at the same time, and sort of think about how to produce, I guess I was calling it earlier, this musicking, this putting these two very different kinds of expression to the point at which they actually do start to repeat in one another. They resonate in a strong sense. But I'm parroting you, Danveer, if you want to intervene here and correct my misrepresentation. That would be great.
No, it's just you put records on and ask students to talk about them. It's not rocket science, but but I think what Nicola described is, I think I'm blanking on the name, but there's a certain Black arts poet critic, I think his name's Stephen Henderson, and he talks about mass cons, or massive concentrations of experimental energy. He used them as a way to describe the effect of Black poetry. But if you read a fantastic book by Fumi Akiji called Jazz as Critique, and in it she plays on this idea of mass con by talking about playing several recordings, different recordings of artists who you might not think belong in the same space, but she wants to place them together. She argues if you play them, like, I think it's like Nina Simone, basically it's different versions of the same song, a certain jazz standard. So Louis Armstrong playing it, Nina Simone playing it, Billie Holiday and another artist. If you play them all at the same time, you set off this mass con, this massive concentration of experimental energy. I think it's exactly what you described. It would not only be Julius Eastman and Barry White, but then Nkisi at the same time to generate a type of mascon, and to see what kind of sparks fly off in the midst of that.
And I would add to that DJ Linnae Denise and her formulations of DJ scholarship, which I think would be in resonance with that, which sounds brilliant, because it has the power. It clearly, what you're describing, Danveer, like resets. It resets and it opens up a perspective dimension, you know, in the moment of listening. And the more you add, the more mascon you get. So yes, I couldn't agree more. But certainly when DJ Linnae Denise was, there was a kind of memorial for Greg Tate, which was it was at 1 p.m. It was at 7 p.m. US time, which is 1 a.m. in the UK. And so many people spoke, over 100 people present, but DJ Linnae Denise was one of the DJs present throughout the 6
It was 12 hours. It was a 12 to 15 hour.
It went on for many hours.
Gathering.
So she was talking about the records that her and Greg Tate discussed. And then she was playing records that they talked about. So the records had this profound relation to the event, which was kind of a wake. But they spoke back to their friendship, and they spoke in the present to the wake, and they spoke in the future to all the people all the friends of Greg who were and were not present. Mm. And there I really, I really began to get a sense of what she meant by DJ scholarship, which seems a self-evident thing, except that nobody's formulated it before. So it's not that evident, you know, quite the opposite.
Sam,
I just wanted to, I felt like I just wanted to quickly bring in to the frame the kind of pedagogical aspects, or I suppose the slightly different formulations of discursive activity that were enabled by the performance and the rehearsal process, and actually I feel like in some ways personally, as an artist and an academic, I learned most from that experience of being in the theatre with Elaine and Anton and the students, and the mixture of art and music students who were all like kind of neophytes, you know, to this music, in the fact that they but at the same time Anton and Elaine were actually saying you are fully equipped to deal with this music, and so all of that, those problematics and contradictions were there in that moment, and I think that's something that we need to sustain in terms of, and perhaps connecting to some of the the anti-racism projects that Nicola brought into this back into this conversation. I think we need to make sure that it's a kind of multimodal approach, and I go back to some of my earliest experiences at the university with Griselda Pollock, taking students to the opera and actually learning to do the humming chorus with Opera North from Madame Butterfly, and actually getting more of a sense of the geisha's kind of like the only the emancipatory act of not singing, of removing her kind of her song, and the geisha sings no more, which is her kind of last aria, but actually being in the hall and humming and feeling what that is like, and the pressure and resistance of that was really much more enlightening than all of the kind of more traditional work on opera that we were doing. So yeah, I think there's the practice research, or whatever you want to call it. I think these things are Eastman, there's a generosity in there to actually engage with these things through the actual performing of the work, and there's space for amateur, professional, different kinds of experiences to be to kind of contribute productively in the realization of the work, which is very, very clear when once you're in a rehearsal or performance of it.
I'm going to bring Danveer back in just for a second here, because I'm thinking about DJ pedagogy, but I'm also thinking about his work on footwork, which is South Chicago, West Chicago sort of style of musical dance performance. And I mean, it raises questions about, you know, how differently one might listen to Barry White versus Julius Eastman, and what it would mean to mash them in terms of what the body will do. But I was just thinking about the incredible emphasis in footwork on turn taking. I mean, it seems to me that that's an important bit in any kind of improvisational work in the space of a university. It's one thing for a DJ to come in with a stack of records or discs. It's another thing to find the means by which we rotate and move through sources. So I don't know if there's anything there in that practice, Danveer, that you think is pertinent to thinking through improvisation and pedagogy.
I don't know. Teaching for me is a job. It's a way I earn a living. But then what you try to do in your job is, from various jobs I've done, you know, from the unpaid labor in my parents' shop, getting up at 5 in the morning to deliver newspapers or get milk out of a van, or working in a Pizza Hut or a golf club, is you always try and make them enjoyable somehow.
Yeah.
And I guess the main thing I try to do with pedagogy is just try to generate a type of conversation, and an atmosphere of conversation. I think it's method you teach more than subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's it. You teach a method more than subject matter. The subject matter you sneak in the midst, or you sneak the method in, sorry, under the guise of subject matter. I think that's the way I approach it. But actually, something that I had to dig it out. In Nicola's kind of initial kind of statement and reflection, particularly in regards to institutions and pedagogy, I've been kind of trying to dive into the body of work that Gil Scott Heron kind of left behind. And there's a particular preface to one of his novels, which not many people take much notice of, the novels he wrote. And there's a preface to one of his novels called the N Factory, and it's basically an account of campus politics in the 60s and race in the institution. And particularly, actually, what you get in America is historical Black institutions, colleges and universities. And he has this great preface at the start, and I've got a screenshot of it, and I can put it in the chat, where he goes, "Black colleges and universities have been both a blessing and a curse on Black people. The institutions have educated thousands of our people who would never have had the opportunity to get an education otherwise. They have supplied for many a new sense of dignity and integrity. They have never, however, made anybody equal." And I think there's a kind of I think something that just struck me, and I think I find worth keeping in mind when we're dealing with institutional politics, particularly the institutional politics of race, is that just sometimes I think it's I'm always careful of what I ask for, because if an institution gives it to you, then you're in real trouble. I find you're in real trouble. I think it's always good to have an escape mechanism. But yeah, that's just me. I can put it in the chat anyway.
Yeah, please do. But I doubt you're alone on that piece of wisdom. I'm beginning to sense that we have reached our limit in terms of the time we've set aside for this, and perhaps even the energy and goodwill of everyone who has devoted themselves to the activity. Is there a final thought? Something you'd like to say, Sam, about where we're going from here in terms of the Sadler Seminar, anything? And otherwise we can, I think, say good night or wherever we are, I suppose.
Yeah, and well, just thank you so much. I mean, this has been really, really special. I mean, this whole series has been, really, some of the most amazing moments of my academic career and as well career as an artist as well. Thank you for all of the contributions and I hear the call to kind of make sure that the kind of discussions and the kind of ideas and methodologies that are coming out of this process are kind of taken up and kind of embedded within other kind of whether it's EDI or kind of philosophical inquiries that are going on. But in terms of the tunings of the world, this is very much the center. But we have Scott McLaughlin, one of the other project partners, is going to do a session about attuning to materials, and particularly taking this idea of temperament. If we think about like the pianos within third part and Eva Len, taking this idea further in terms of maybe going after the idea of kind of equal temperament and kind of Western tuning, and really trying to rethink and attune to that. And then towards the end of the academic year, we have Mikhail Karikis, who is going to, and Joseph Kohlmeyer, who are going to bring back Murray Schafer, which really, like, his passing was a kind of one of the kind of constellations of things that we wanted to try and respond to. But we will use the Eventbrite kind of context to share this information for people if they wish, and again the documentation of this, because I know I'll be kind of going back over and recovering some of the references and ideas. Thank you, but I feel that the form of the third part of the third measure, the idea that all of the material has to kind of like end up in the final part, I feel like that's what's happened here a little bit here, and I would like, and I think that's possibly a kind of quite an exciting approach to symposia and kind of interdisciplinary projects that and there's still opportunity to see the film in the school until tomorrow until 5 p.m. Check out the performance on YouTube before that comes down, and continuing to engage with all of the contributors. So just to make sure I don't miss anybody, I thank you to Isaac, Jean-Francois, thanks to Elaine, Michner, Kojo and Angelica, thank you so much, and for being the kind of like the core and the thread of all of this and connecting the different parts. The second session, thanks to Danvir Singh Brar, Nicholas Singh, and I also want to make a special thank to Ed McKeon as well, our postdoc, who has actually done a lot of the kind of the legwork and structural work in making sure this goes really smoothly, and in light of all of the storms and strikes and viruses. So thank you very much, everybody, and stay in touch and keep connecting with us and the university.
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say just briefly, so yeah, thank you, Sam, for making this happen through like endless emails. Thanks for all your patience from beginning to end. Thanks to John for making it happen, to Elaine and to Isaac for being friends and allies. Thank you to Danvir and Nicola for their brilliant presentations. And I'd like to second Danvir. I think Fumio Koji's book Jazz's critique is brilliant. It's a brilliant book from start to finish. I'd say one of the best books of the last decade, along with Dan Veer's own book, Sonic Ecologies, which is equally excellent. I just wanted to end by quoting a bit from Fumi Koji's book. She says a lot of the things that I think I've been struggling to articulate in a really eloquently concise and powerful and complex way. So she says, Black music is socio-musical play. It is not so much that it represents Black life or an alternative human future. Rather, it demonstrates to us how to articulate ourselves towards Blackness and toward another world. It shows us how we might go about dispositioning ourselves so that we might know how it feels to be a conflicted subject, both human and inhuman, American and Black, in brackets African, and both the Black and heterogeneous, fecund Blackness. I think that's a very compelling formulation.
I don't think it's going to get better than that. So. Thank you all very, very much, and take good care of yourselves.